The wagon wheel dropped into a rut with a crack that felt final, jolting her teeth together. Outside, the wind had been a constant pressure for the last hour, a physical thing pushing against the canvas cover, scouring the land of sound and warmth. When the driver finally pulled the mules to a halt, the silence that rushed in was just as loud. "This is it," he said, not turning around. Mai pushed aside the stiff flap and descended, her dark blue dress immediately plastered to her legs by the wind. The land was a study in brown and grey, a vast, exhausted flatness under a sky the color of dishwater. The house was smaller than she had pictured, its wood weathered to the bone, a curl of smoke leaking from its stone chimney like a last, weary sigh. A man stood on the porch, motionless, his form a dark shape against the pale wood. He did not move as she approached, her small trunk bumping against her knees. He was tall, built of long lines and stillness, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn hat. He watched her come up the 3 sagging steps, his eyes missing nothing of her journey, of the dust settled on her shoulders, of the way she held herself straight against the wind and his scrutiny. "You're Mai," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she replied, her own voice sounding thin in the immense quiet. His name was Rory O'Connell. The letter had said so. It had said he had 1,000 acres and a flock of merino sheep. It had not mentioned the grief that clung to the house like the frost lingering in the shadows, or the way failure had settled into the sag of the fence lines. He gave a short, sharp nod toward the house. Inside. It was an order, but his tone was flat, devoid of heat. Inside was one large room, spare and clean but worn. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs. A curtained-off corner for a bed. He set her trunk down by the door with a thud that seemed to punctuate the end of her old life. "The wool shed is out back," he said, turning back to the door. "That's the work." He did not speak of the other part of their arrangement, the part that had brought her 2,000 miles across an ocean and a continent. The part that made her presence in this room a silent, binding contract. He simply stated the practical reality. The wool. She watched him go, his shoulders set against the wind as he headed toward a long, low barn. She stood in the center of the room, the chill of the floorboard seeping through the soles of her shoes. She ran a hand over the rough wood of the table, then walked to the single window, its glass wavy and clouded with dust. Outside, the prairie stretched on, indifferent. She saw him moving among the sheep in a distant paddock, a slow, methodical shape in the failing light. They were thin, their coats ragged. The land was thin, too. Everything here felt pared down to the essential, to the hard, ungiving core of things. She unpacked her trunk. 2 more dresses, a set of needles and thread, a small pouch of dried herbs, and a book of columns and numbers, its pages filled with her own neat, precise script. She placed it at the bottom, a hidden weight. Then she went back outside, pulling her shawl tight, and walked toward the wool shed. The door groaned open into a cavern of dust motes and the thick, greasy smell of raw fleece. Sacks of it were piled in the corners, some spilling their contents onto the dirt floor. A rough sorting table stood in the center, along with a pair of hand carders, their wire teeth clogged and bent. It was a place of neglect, of work started and abandoned. He expected her to card the wool. That was the bargain. She picked up a handful of fleece. It was matted, full of burrs and bits of dried manure. The quality was poor, the fibers brittle. She let it fall from her fingers. She looked around the shed, at the disorganized piles, at the leaking roof that had allowed damp to creep into a stack of burlap sacks, turning the wool within to a felted, useless mass. This was not just a task. It was a diagnosis. She spent the rest of the daylight sorting. She did not card a single fiber. Instead, she made 3 piles. One for wool that was salvageable. One for wool that was hopelessly ruined. And a third, much smaller pile, for the fleeces that were merely dirty, the ones that held a hint of promise, a ghost of the lanolin and crimp they should have possessed. As darkness fell, she heard his boots on the gravel outside. He stopped in the doorway, a silhouette against the deep indigo of the twilight sky. He looked at her piles, at the clear space she had swept in the center of the floor, at the ruined wool she had separated out. He said nothing. He simply watched her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he turned and walked back to the house. When she followed minutes later, a plate of bread and salted meat was on the table, and a small fire was built up in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the flames and the ceaseless moan of the wind. He had not told her where she was to sleep, and she did not ask. When he rose and disappeared behind the curtained-off alcove, she took a blanket from her trunk, wrapped it around herself, and settled into the chair by the dying fire. The floorboards were cold, the house full of drafts, but for the first time that day, the wind outside seemed a little farther away. She closed her eyes and saw not the endless brown prairie, but columns of numbers, neat and orderly. In the dark, she began her true work, the work of accounting. She started with the pile of ruined wool, estimating its weight, its lost value. A debt owed to the wind, and the rain, and the quiet despair that had let it rot. She slept there in the chair, and in the deep of the night, she heard him add another log to the fire, the soft thud of the wood a temporary truce against the cold. The small orange glow warmed her face, a silent, unacknowledged concession. On a splintered fence post just outside the door, a single, frost-rimmed feather trembled in the unending wind. February bled into March, the wind shifting from a blade to a damp, insistent chill. The snow, when it came, was wet and heavy, melting into a mud that sucked at the boots and clung to the hem of Mai's dress. The work was a rhythm that defined their days. Before dawn, she would be in the kitchen, stoking the fire, putting water on to boil. He would enter from the barn, smelling of hay and cold air, and they would drink the hot water in silence before he went back out to feed the flock. She spent her days in the wool shed, which she had transformed. The leaks were patched with canvas and tar. The floor was swept clean. The wool was sorted, washed in careful batches, and laid out to dry on clean racks she had fashioned from scrap lumber. The hand carders were useless. She had spent an evening painstakingly straightening the bent wire teeth with a pair of pliers, but the tool was too small, too inefficient for the mountain of fleece. She watched Rory one afternoon as he struggled to mend a broken axle on the wagon, his hands sure and strong as he worked the metal. She saw the way he understood the mechanics of the thing, the logic of its parts. That evening, she drew a diagram on a piece of scrap paper. It was a simple machine, a drum carder, with two rotating cylinders covered in wire cloth, turned by a hand crank. A larger version of the tool she knew, but built on a scale for production. She left the drawing on the table when she went to the wool shed the next morning. When she returned at midday, the drawing was gone. He said nothing of it. For 2 days, there was the sound of hammering from the barn, the screech of metal being filed. On the 3rd day, he carried it into the wool shed. It was rough, built from old crate wood and salvaged parts, but it was exactly what she had drawn. The cylinders turned smoothly, the wire cloth he'd fashioned was even and sharp. "Will it work?" he asked. It was the longest sentence he had spoken to her. She ran a handful of washed wool through it. A wide, soft, airy bat emerged from the other side, the fibers perfectly aligned. It was beautiful. "Yes," she said. "It will work." He watched her feed the wool into the machine, the steady rhythm of the crank, the clean, uniform output. A small muscle worked in his jaw. He had understood the drawing. He had seen the need and met it. It was a conversation held in diagrams and wood and wire. The town, Providence, was a day's ride away. They went once a month for supplies. It was a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled against the vastness of the plains. Here, Mai was an object of quiet curiosity. The women in the general store, their faces pinched with cold and suspicion, watched her measure out flour and salt. They whispered behind their hands, their gazes lingering on her straight black hair, her quiet efficiency. Rory stood by the door, a silent guard, his presence deflecting any open hostility but inviting speculation. He never introduced her. He never explained her. She was simply there. The storekeeper, a man named Miller, was the only one who spoke to her directly. "Find in everything you need," he'd ask, his eyes kind but his smile hesitant. "Yes, thank you," she would reply, and the simple courtesy seemed to surprise him every time. One trip, Rory was speaking with another rancher, his back to her, when she heard one of the women say, just loud enough to be heard, "Bought himself some help, looks like. Cheaper than high rin, I suppose." My did not turn. She continued counting out coins for a spool of thread, her face serene. But she felt Rory's conversation stop. The air in the small store grew tight. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over the women who suddenly found the contents of their baskets fascinating. He didn't say a word. He just looked, and the silence stretched until it was uncomfortable, then unbearable. He walked to the counter, placed his hand next to hers, and added a small bag of horehound candies to their supplies. He paid Miller, picked up their sacks, and walked out. She followed. The candies were a small, bitter luxury. He had never bought them before. It was an apology. It was a defense. Lambing season arrived with the first true thaw. The nights were a constant vigil. The flock was weak after the hard winter, the ewes struggling. Rory moved through the lambing pens with a grim, exhausted competence. He lost 2 lambs the first night, their bodies small and still in the cold straw. The third ewe was in trouble, her labor stalled. Rory worked with her, his face tight with concentration, but the lamb was born too weak to stand, its breath a shallow flutter. He laid it aside in the straw. "It's gone," he said, his voice rough. He turned his attention to the exhausted mother. I knelt by the tiny creature. It was cold, its gums pale. She had seen this before. She scooped it up, wrapping it in her shawl, and carried it to the house, its weight next to nothing in her arms. By the fire, she brewed a tea from the herbs she had brought with her, a pungent, earthy-smelling concoction. Using a clean rag as a wick, she dripped the warm liquid into the corner of the lamb's mouth. She rubbed its chest, her fingers working rhythmically, trying to coax the life back into its fragile body. Hours passed. The fire burned down to embers. The lamb remained limp in her lap. Rory came in near dawn, his face grey with fatigue. He stopped when he saw her, the lamb still cradled in her arms. "It's no use," he said, his voice gentle for the first time. "You should rest." She shook her head, not looking at him. She dipped the rag again, squeezed another drop of the warm liquid into its mouth. And then, a flicker. An eyelid trembled. A tiny, shuddering breath. The lamb gave a weak bleat, a sound no louder than a sigh. She felt its legs tense, a feeble push against her hands. Rory knelt beside her, his weariness forgotten. He touched the lamb's side, feeling the faint but steady beat of its heart. He looked from the creature to her face, illuminated by the soft glow of the embers. Her expression was calm, focused. She had not given up. He had. He rose without a word and went outside. He returned with a wooden box lined with his own wool coat and placed it by the hearth. Together, they settled the lamb into the makeshift incubator. He added more wood to the fire, building it up until the room was filled with a steady, enveloping warmth. He did not go back to the barn. He sat in the other chair, watching her, watching the lamb, as the first grey light of morning crept through the window. The scent of her herbs mingled with the smell of wood smoke and damp wool, a strange, hopeful perfume. On her hands, she could still feel the phantom touch of the lamb's coat, and under it, the faint, stubborn pulse of a life she had refused to surrender. The summer heat settled over the prairie, baking the earth and bleaching the grass to a pale gold. The days were long, filled with the hum of insects and the steady, monotonous work of the ranch. The rescued lamb, which Mai had named Bow, or Treasure, was a constant, tumbling presence, following her between the house and the wool shed. The rest of the flock was stronger now, grazing on the tough summer grasses, their new coats growing in thick and clean. With the wool from the spring shearing all carded and ready, Mai turned her attention to the ranch's finances. Rory kept his records in a leather-bound ledger, the pages filled with a sprawling, near-illegible script. Receipts and bills were stuffed between the pages, a chaotic history of transactions. He gave it to her with a shrug, as if handing over a burden he was glad to be rid of. "It's all there," he said. more or less. She spent the long, hot evenings at the table, a lantern casting a pool of yellow light on the open book. She created new pages, drawing clean, straight columns with a ruler and a pen. Date. Item. Debit. Credit. She transcribed his messy entries, deciphering the names and numbers, imposing order on the chaos. It was like untangling a hopelessly knotted skein of yarn. Slowly, patiently, a pattern began to emerge. The ranch was not just failing, it was being bled dry. Every year, for the past 5 years since his father's death, the price Rory received for his wool from Mr. Finch, the sole wool buyer in Providence, had dropped. Yet the records from the year before his father passed showed a flock of similar size and quality fetching nearly double the price. She found the old weight slips. Finch scales seemed to get heavier every season. 100 pounds of fleece in Rory's log would become 85 on Finch receipt. The grade he assigned to the wool was consistently low, citing burrs, weakness, or discoloration. But Mai knew the quality of the wool she had just spent months cleaning and carding. It wasn't prize-winning, not yet, but it wasn't the poor-grade stuff Finch's notes described. It was not a bold, dramatic theft. It was a slow, systemic erosion, a quiet exploitation of Rory's grief and inattention. Finch was a pillar of the Providence community, a church deacon, a man everyone trusted. He banked on that trust. He banked on ranchers being too tired, too overwhelmed, to check the numbers, to question the scales. He was not a villain, he was an opportunist, his dishonesty buffered by years of complacency. One evening, Rory came in from checking the fences, his face streaked with dust and sweat. He stopped behind her, looking over her shoulder at the 2 pages she had laid side by side. On the left was a transcription of his ledger for the last sale. On the right was her own projection, based on her meticulous weighing of the carded bats and a conservative estimate of fair market prices she'd found in an old farmer's almanac. The difference was stark. It was the cost of a new ram, of winter feed, of a repaired roof. It was the difference between survival and ruin. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low. "His numbers," she said, tapping the left page. "And what I believe are the true numbers." She pointed to a specific entry. "He recorded your weight at 412 pounds. I weighed the same lot at 480. He graded it as common. It is at least half-blood grade. The discrepancy is," she paused, checking her own column of figures, $160. It was a fortune. Rory stared at the pages, his face hardening. He was not a man of numbers, but he understood the stark reality of the ink on the page. He understood the years of breaking his back for a price that was never quite enough, the constant, gnawing pressure of debt he could never seem to get ahead of. He traced the line of her neat column with a calloused finger, the sharp, precise black ink so different from his own defeated scrawl. He saw not just the lost money, but the quiet, methodical intelligence that had uncovered it. He saw the hours she had spent, the care she had taken. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes beyond grief and exhaustion. It was a slow-burning anger. A spark of the fight he had lost years ago. He did not thank her. He did not rage or curse. He simply stood there for a long time, his hand resting on the table next to hers, his gaze fixed on the irrefutable truth she had laid bare. "The fall shearing," he said finally, his voice tight. "We'll take it to him then." It wasn't a question. It was a promise. The crickets chirped outside in the hot, dry darkness, oblivious. Inside, the lantern flame burned steady, without a flicker, illuminating the 2 columns. One represented the past, a story of quiet loss and resignation. The other was a declaration of the future, a precise and unyielding demand for what was right. The sharp, clean line of her ink-drawn column was a weapon, forged in patience and held in reserve. Autumn arrived in a blaze of gold on the cottonwoods down by the creek, a brief, beautiful respite before the grey hand of winter closed its fist. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant wood smoke. The shearing was a 2-day affair of sweat and dust and the incessant bleating of sheep. Rory worked with a focused intensity Mai had not seen before, his movements quick and sure. She was beside him, not shearing, but gathering the fleeces as they fell, keeping them clean, sorting them immediately by quality into marked burlap sacks. She weighed each sack on a new scale, a proper balance scale she'd insisted they buy in town, and recorded the weight in her ledger. They loaded the wagon in the pre-dawn chill, the sacks of wool piled high. Rory handled the reins, his jaw set. Mai sat beside him on the hard wooden seat, her own ledger tucked safely in a canvas bag at her feet. The ride to Providence was silent, the rhythmic clopping of the mule's hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels the only sounds. Finch's Mercantile and Wool Exchange was the largest building in town, its windows clean, its brass sign polished. Inside, the air was close, smelling of milled lumber, tobacco, and the oily scent of raw fleece. 2 other ranchers were ahead of them, their expressions dour as they accepted Finch's tallied slips and meager payments. Mr. Finch himself was a portly man with soft hands and a practiced, benevolent smile. He greeted Rory with an easy familiarity that now seemed predatory. "Rory, my boy," he said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Good to see you. Let's see what you've brought us." His men unloaded the wagon while Finch led them into his office, a cramped room dominated by a large oak desk. He gestured for them to sit, but only Mai took a chair. Rory remained standing, his arms crossed, a silent, watchful presence by the door. Finch's clerk brought in the weight slip. Finch made a show of studying it, pursing his lips. "A bit light this year, Rory. And the quality," he sighed, "a performance of regret. Mark it soft. Best I can do is this." He scribbled a figure on a piece of paper and pushed it across the desk. It was insultingly low. It was the same slow poison as every year before. Rory looked at the number, then at Mai. She met his gaze with a small, steady nod. She rose from her chair, took her own ledger from the canvas bag, and placed it on the desk beside Finch's slip. She opened it to the final tally page. Her script was a stark contrast to Finch's hasty scrawl, each number perfectly formed, each line perfectly straight. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the small room. "There seems to be a discrepancy." Finch looked at her, his smile faltering for the first time. "Your weight is recorded at 790 pounds, she said, her finger tracing the line in his book. "My own record, from a balanced scale, is 942 pounds. She turned a page in her ledger. "Furthermore, you've graded the entire lot as common fleece. I have sorted it. Over 200 pounds of it is fine grade, suitable for worsted yarn, which commands a higher price. The price you have offered does not reflect the weight or the quality of the product." She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse him of theft. She simply stated the facts as her numbers showed them. The quiet authority in her voice was more damning than any shout. Finch's face, usually ruddy, had gone pale. He sputtered, "Now see here, my scales are certified." "Perhaps they are," Mai said calmly. "But they are wrong. As are your assessments." She pushed her ledger closer to him. "My numbers are correct." The 2 ranchers who had been lingering in the outer office, drawn by the unusual quiet, now stood in the doorway. They looked from Finch's sweating face to the small, composed woman and her open book. They looked at the silent, imposing figure of Rory O'Connell standing guard. A seed of doubt, of their own long-nursed suspicions, began to sprout. Finch looked at Mai's ledger, at the undeniable neatness of it, the sheer, irrefutable evidence of her diligence. He looked at Rory's stony expression. He looked at the other ranchers in the doorway, their faces now hard with dawning comprehension. He was a man accustomed to deference, to the easy power of his position. He was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by a quiet Chinese woman and a ledger full of immaculate numbers. His bluff had been called, his comfortable system shattered. He picked up his pen, his hand shaking slightly. He scratched out his initial offer. He took out a fresh sheet of paper and began to calculate again, this time with Mai's ledger open beside his own. The silence in the room was absolute. When he finished, he pushed the new paper across the desk. The figure was nearly 3 times the original offer. It was the correct price. Rory took the paper, folded it, and put it in his pocket. He looked at a long, deep look of respect, of partnership. "We'll take our payment now," he said, his voice level. As Finch counted out the money, his hands fumbling, one of the other ranchers stepped forward. "Mr. Finch," he said, a new edge to his voice. "I'd like you to take another look at my tally from this morning." Mai took her ledger from the desk. She had not won a battle with shouting or threats, but with the quiet, unassailable power of the truth, recorded in ink. As they walked out into the bright autumn sunlight, the money a heavy, satisfying weight in Rory's pocket, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had balanced the books. Mr. Finch's ink-stained thumb, which had hovered over her numbers in a moment of stunned paralysis, was the image that stayed with her, the mark of a small, grubby injustice brought to a final, clean accounting. The first snow of the next winter came early, a fine, glittering dust that outlined every fence post and blade of dormant grass in silver. It found a different ranch from the one Mai had arrived at a year before. The roof of the house no longer leaked. The barn was stocked to the rafters with hay and feed. The flock, well-fed and healthy, huddled in the leeward side of the barn, their thick coats a testament to a season of good grazing and careful husbandry. Inside the small house, a fire burned brightly in the hearth, its warmth pushing back the chill that seeped through the window panes. The room was the same, yet entirely changed. New curtains, sewn by Mai from bolts of calico bought with the wool money, hung at the window. A bookshelf, built by Rory, stood against one wall, holding a handful of books and her precious ledgers. It was a home now, not just a shelter. Their life had settled into a new rhythm, one of shared work and comfortable silence. The silences were different now, not born of distance and grief, but of a deep, unspoken understanding. They moved around each other in the small space with an easy grace, a partnership that needed few words. He learned to read the slight furrow in her brow that meant he was looking unwell. She learned the subtle shift in his posture that spoke of his weariness or his contentment. The people in Providence treated her differently now. The story of the confrontation in Finch's office had become a quiet legend. Ranchers who had been cheated for years found a new courage. They came to the O'Connell ranch, hats in hand, not to speak to Rory, but to Mai. They would ask her to look over their books, to advise them on weights and grades. She never refused, sharing her knowledge as freely as she had applied it to their own salvation. The women in Miller's store now met her eyes, offering a hesitant smile, a nod of respect. She was no longer the outsider, the mail-order curiosity. She was Mrs. O'Connell, the woman who knew numbers, the woman who had faced down Silas Finch with nothing but a pen and the truth. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, piling snow against the door and howling in the chimney, Mai sat by the fire, mending one of Rory's work shirts. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows, a testament to his labor. The house was filled with the smell of baking bread and the steady hiss of the snow against the windows. Rory sat across from her, cleaning a piece of harness leather. He worked for a time, then set it aside. He watched her, his expression thoughtful in the flickering firelight. Her hands moved with a quick, efficient grace, the needle dipping in and out of the rough fabric. He rose and went to her trunk, which now sat at the foot of her bed in the main room. He opened it and took out the dark blue dress she had been wearing when she arrived. It was her best dress, and a seam along the side had come undone during the last trip to town. He brought it to the fire and sat down again. He took a needle and thread from her sewing box. His hands, so large and calloused from ranch work, looked clumsy holding the tiny needle. But he threaded it on the first try and began to stitch the seam, his movement slow and deliberate, his brow furrowed in concentration. Mai stopped her own mending. She watched him, her heart suddenly still in her chest. He was mending her dress. It was such a small, domestic act, yet it felt more profound than any declaration. It was an act of care, of tenderness. It was an acknowledgement of her place here, not just as a worker or a partner, but as a part of his life, a life they were now building together. He did not look up, but he knew she was watching. The only sounds were the roar of the wind outside and the soft crackle of the fire. He finished the seam, knotted the thread with a careful, final stitch, and bit it off. He folded the dress neatly and placed it on the table beside her. He met her eyes across the small space, and in his gaze, she saw the walls of his grief and loneliness finally, completely, dismantled. He gave her a small, slow smile. It transformed his face, erasing the hard lines of worry and leaving only a quiet, deep-seated peace. She smiled back. Nothing needed to be said. The contract of wool and work had been fulfilled long ago. This was something else entirely, something they had woven together out of silence and respect and shared labor. It was a bond as strong and resilient as the fine, worsted wool they would sell next season. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the prairie in a deep, cleansing white. Inside, by the warm fire, the steady, rhythmic pull of his needle through the dark blue fabric of her dress was the only promise she would ever need.